The gloves hit the pavement an inch from my sneakers, and the whole street went quiet enough to hear the ice cracking in someone's lemonade. 22 years old black belt, undefeated in 3 amateur cages. And he was smiling at me like I was already on the ground. He had a phone out. He had an audience. What he didn't have was any idea that I'd spent the last 2 decades training men twice his size to survive things he couldn't spell. I looked down at those gloves, then back up at him, and I asked the only question that mattered. Are you sure? My name is Ashley Parker. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, the only people who knew my rank called me Colonel, and meant it with their whole chest. But on Lark Spur Lane, in the quiet manicured culde-sacs of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, I was just the woman at the end of the street who mowed her own lawn and drove a Ford F-150 with a dent in the tailgate that I never bothered to fix. I moved there in June after my son Ethan finished 9th grade, looking for exactly what the real estate listing promised: peace. 20 years in the Army will do that to you. It teaches you to crave quiet the way other people crave excitement. I'd commanded soldiers in the 75th Ranger Regiment, led night operations where the margin for error was the width of a heartbeat, and briefed generals who didn't blink when I corrected them. But none of that mattered here. Here I was just Ashley, a single mother, a woman who kept to herself, who waved at the mail carrier and who didn't feel the need to explain what she used to do for a living. I liked it that way. I liked that nobody looked at me twice. The house next door belonged to Richard Coleman, a real estate developer who'd built half the shopping centers on the east side of the county and never let anyone forget it. He drove a white Escalade that he backed into the driveway every single time, engine idling a beat too long, like he wanted the whole block to register his arrival. His son Brandon was 22, home from a semester he dropped out of, and deep into what he called his fight career, amateur MMA. A blue belt turned purple turned black in what felt like record time. Though I never once saw him spar with anyone who could actually hurt him, he had 12,000 followers and a highlight reel set to music that thumped through his open garage every afternoon. I noticed him before he noticed me. That's usually how it goes with men like Brandon. They're so busy being watched that they don't watch back. He revved his motorcycle at 6:00 in the morning right under my bedroom window, 3 days in a row before I even said a word. He took up 2 parking spots outside the community mailbox, like it was his personal reserved lot. I watched him once from my porch shoulder check a delivery driver half his size, just because the man's cart was blocking the sidewalk for 4 seconds too long. Nobody said anything. That's the thing about neighborhoods like Cedar Ridge. Everyone's polite until the moment politeness costs them something, and then the silence gets very loud. I started running every morning at 5:30 before the sun cracked over the ridge, because that's when the world still belonged to me and nobody else. Old habit in the regiment. 5:30 was already late. Brandon caught me one morning jogging past his driveway in a faded gray t-shirt and running shorts, and he said something to his buddy loud enough that he clearly wanted me to hear it. She doesn't even look like she could survive 1 round. His friend laughed. I didn't break stride. I didn't turn my head. There's a particular kind of restraint you learn in this life. The kind that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing deliberately not to prove it to strangers. I smiled instead, not for him, not really. For myself, because if he'd known even a fraction of what I'd walked through, he would have swallowed those words before they ever left his mouth. I want to be honest about something. Part of me understood him. I'd seen young men like Brandon before, plenty of them, before the Army got hold of them and reshaped what they thought strength meant. Boys raised on money and mirrors who confuse aggression with confidence because nobody ever taught them the difference. In another life under different discipline, Brandon might have made a decent soldier. He had the aggression, he just didn't have the humility, and nobody in his life seemed interested in teaching it to him. His father certainly wasn't going to. Richard Coleman treated the neighborhood like an extension of his portfolio, something to be managed, curated, and occasionally reminded of who was really in charge. He was cordial to my face in that specific way. Wealthy men are cordial to people they've already decided. Don't matter a firm handshake. A joke about the housing market eyes already moving past me before I finished my sentence. I didn't take it personally. I'd met 100 versions of Richard in my life. Men who mistook their bank account for a chain of command. What I didn't expect, what I genuinely didn't see coming that first month, was how quickly Brandon's attention would drift from me to my son. Ethan was 15 that summer. Quiet and thoughtful in the way kids get when they've moved around more than most, when they've learned not to get too attached to a school or a street, because the army doesn't ask permission before it reassigns you. He rode his bike up and down Lark Spur Lane, in the evenings headphones in minding his own business. He didn't know anything about combives or command presence. He knew about video games, and a girl in his algebra class, and the new skateboard he was saving up for. He was in every way that mattered still just a boy. I watched Brandon watch him one evening from across the street, that same lazy, entitled smile creeping onto his face. And something in my chest went very still and very sharp the way it used to. Right before a briefing I already knew was going to go badly, I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself boys like Brandon eventually got bored and moved on to easier targets. I was wrong. And it wouldn't take long to find out just how wrong I was. There's a particular kind of dread that only parents understand. The one that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles in slowly, like weather changing on the horizon. You feel it before you can name it. By the second week of July, I felt it every time I heard Brandon's motorcycle idle a little too long near our end of the street. It started small the way these things always do. Brandon would drive slow past the cul-de-sac, where Ethan and a couple of the neighborhood kids played basketball, revving his engine just enough to scatter them off the asphalt. He'd park his truck sideways across the makeshift court they'd claimed at the end of the block, forcing them to relocate. Yield, and he'd sit there in the driver's seat, scrolling his phone, pretending not to notice the game he'd just ended. Once, twice, I could chalk up to carelessness. By the fourth time, I understood it wasn't carelessness at all. It was a message. This street, this space belonged to him, and everyone else existed on his terms. Then it got personal. I came home from a long day of video conference with Army Futures Command that ran 2 hours over the kind of day that leaves your jaw sore from clenching it, and found Ethan sitting on our front steps, quiet in a way that immediately put me on alert. He wasn't crying. My son doesn't cry easily. Hasn't since he was maybe 9. But there's a stillness he gets when something's eating at him. A stillness I recognized because I'd seen it in young soldiers after their first hard lesson about the world. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting my bag down slow, giving him room. He shrugged. "Brandon called me Mommy's little soldier in front of everyone at the court today." Said it like a joke. Everybody laughed. I felt something tight and low in my stomach, an old and familiar heat I hadn't felt in years. Not since the last time I'd watched someone underestimate the people under my command and pay for it. But I kept my voice level, because that's the job. That's always been the job. Not the absence of anger, but the discipline to not let it drive. "What did you say back?" I asked. "Nothing." What was I supposed to say? I sat down next to him on the step close enough that our shoulders touched. "Nothing tonight." That's the right answer. "Ethan, listen to me. Don't fight people who are desperate to prove something. That kind of hunger, it's bottomless. You can't satisfy it by giving him a reaction, you just feed it." He nodded. But I could tell the words didn't land the way I wanted them to. 15-year-olds don't run on wisdom. They run on humiliation and the desperate need to undo it. I understood that. I'd been 15 once too, though it felt like a different woman's life by now. I hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 10 days later, on a warm Saturday afternoon that should have been unremarkable, I was inside prepping dinner when I heard raised voices outside Brandon's laugh, cutting through the open kitchen window, sharp and performative. I stepped onto the porch and found Ethan standing over his bike, which was on its side in the middle of the street front wheel, still spinning chain half off the sprocket. Brandon stood a few feet away with his phone raised, filming, grinning at the screen like he was building toward a punchline. "Say it again." Brandon was saying clearly to the camera and not to Ethan, Say what you called me. Ethan's face was red, jaw tight, hands curled at his sides in that helpless, furious way kids get when they're outmatched and know it. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked the same measured pace I'd use approaching a situation that needed control, not chaos. Because chaos is exactly what an aggressor wants from you. It confirms they've gotten under your skin. Pick up the bike, I said, not loud. I didn't need loud. Brandon lowered the phone just enough to look at me, that same lazy smirk still hanging off his face. Or what? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him. Really? Look the way you look at a threat assessment cataloging, without judgment. Without heat, just information mile. His stance was loose, weight forward, the posture of someone used to being the most dangerous person in any room he walked into. His eyes, though, flickered for half a second under my gaze. Something involuntary and small, a flash of uncertainty. He probably didn't even register himself. I've seen that flicker in men, 3 times his size, right before they decide it's smarter to back down than to test the thing standing in front of them. For a moment, I thought he might actually pick up the bike. That's when Richard's Escalade pulled into the driveway, and he stepped out mid-phone call, taking in the scene with the mild irritation of a man interrupted during something important. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if Ethan was okay. He looked at me standing on the street in my gardening clothes, dirt still on my knees from the flower bed I'd been working, and something about my stillness seemed to amuse him. "You military people," he said, finishing his call and slipping the phone into his blazer pocket. "Always think rank matters outside the base." I could have said a dozen things in that moment. I could have told him exactly what rank had taught me. Exactly what it meant to hold the line when everyone around you wanted to break formation. Exactly how many young men and women I'd watched grow into people far better than the boy currently filming my son's humiliation for likes. Instead, I said nothing. I picked up Ethan's bike myself, set it upright, and walked it back toward our garage while my son trailed behind me, confused and a little embarrassed by my silence. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked once we were inside, voice cracking with something between frustration and disappointment. "Because he wanted a reaction," I told him, setting the bike against the wall. "And I don't hand out what people want from me just because they're loud enough to demand it." But that night, lying awake long after Ethan had gone to bed, I felt the old current stirring underneath my calm. The same current I used to feel the night before an operation when stillness on the surface meant something entirely different was moving underneath. I understood with total clarity that this wasn't over. Boys like Brandon didn't stop because you walked away. They stopped when the world finally showed them undeniably that walking away had never once been the same thing as being afraid. I just didn't know yet how public that lesson was about to become. Labor Day in Cedar Ridge was an institution. Every year the HOA closed off half of Lark Spur Lane. Folding tables went up under string lights. Someone's smoker filled the whole cul-de-sac with the smell of brisket by noon, and every family on the street showed up whether they liked their neighbors or not. It was the one day a year the entire community occupied the same square of pavement, and by 4 in the afternoon that square of pavement was packed. I almost didn't go. I'd had a rough week, a budget review that ran long, a phone call with a general who liked to hear himself talk, the low hum of exhaustion that never fully leaves you no matter how many years you've been doing the job. But Ethan wanted to go. Wanted a normal afternoon with normal neighborhood kids doing normal neighborhood things, and after the summer he'd had, I wasn't about to deny him that. We arrived a little after 3. I wore jeans and an old gray Henley hair pulled back, nothing that would draw a second look. That was always the point. I brought a bowl of pasta salad, because that's what you bring to these things. And I found a spot near the Hendersons' driveway where I could keep half an eye on Ethan while he threw a football around with a couple of boys his age. Brandon showed up around 4 already. A few beers in, moving through the crowd with the loose, expansive energy of someone who knew he was the most physically imposing person at the party, and had decided that fact entitled him to the floor. He'd brought his fight highlight reel up on somebody's phone at one point, narrating his own knockouts like a sports announcer, And the small cluster of people around him laughed at all the right moments. The way people laugh when they're humoring someone, rather than genuinely entertained. I watched it from a distance, sipping lemonade, saying nothing, wanting nothing more than to get through the afternoon, without incident. Around 5, the sun dipping low enough to turn everything gold. Brandon's voice rose above the general chatter of the party, that particular pitch men get, when they've had just enough alcohol to mistake volume for charisma. "Anybody here think they can beat me?" he called out, arms spread, grinning at the crowd like he already knew the answer. "Come on, anybody. I'll go easy." Nobody answered, a few uncomfortable laughs. Somebody's dad shook his head and turned back to the grill. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was the silence of people who found him exhausting, but didn't want the confrontation of saying so out loud. That silence seemed to bother Brandon more than an outright challenge would have. He scanned the crowd, and I felt it before I saw it, the exact moment his eyes landed on me, standing near the drink table with my lemonade, unremarkable, unbothered. "What about you, Colonel?" he said, and the crowd's attention shifted toward me like a tide changing direction. He'd taken to calling me that as a joke months ago, a mocking little nickname, because Ethan had let it slip once that I served, and Brandon had decided it was funny. A woman with a rank nobody in the neighborhood took seriously. "You're always so quiet, so calm. I bet you think you could take me." I didn't answer. I took a sip of my lemonade. He crossed the pavement toward me, unzipping the small gym bag he'd apparently brought for exactly this moment, and pulled out a pair of MMA gloves, red and worn from use, and dropped them at my feet. They hit the concrete with a soft thud that somehow silenced the entire block. String lights swayed overhead. Someone's phone came up already filming. I felt every eye on that street turn toward us at once. "Come on, Colonel," Brandon said loud enough for everyone to hear, that same performative grin plastered across his face. "Put your money where your mouth is." "I haven't said a word," I said quietly. "Exactly," he shot back, playing to the crowd now, feeding off the attention. "You never do. You just walk around here acting like you're better than everybody, like you know something the rest of us don't. So, show us. Or is the tough guy act just for civilians who don't know any better?" I felt Ethan's eyes on me from across the yard, frozen mid-throw football forgotten in his hands. I felt Richard's presence too, drifting closer with his phone already raised. That same amused superiority on his face, the look of a man who fully expected this to end in his son's favor, and wanted documentation of it. I looked down at the gloves, then back up at Brandon. "Are you sure?" I asked him, calm, even the exact tone I'd have used briefing a room full of colonels twice his age about an operation that carried real risk. Something flickered across his face. That same half-second hesitation I'd caught weeks earlier in the street, quickly buried under bravado. "Scared," he said louder now for the crowd. I reached up and unclasped my watch, handing it without a word to Mrs. Henderson standing nearby, who took it with wide eyes and an somewhere between alarm and disbelief. I walked to where Ethan stood, took my phone from my pocket and handed it to him. "Stand behind the fence." I told him quiet enough that it was just between us. "Whatever happens, stay there." He looked at me like he wanted to ask 100 questions at once, but something in my face must have told him this wasn't the moment. He nodded and backed toward the fence line phone, clutched in both hands, eyes wide. The crowd had gone fully silent now, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your ears. Somebody turned off the music that had been playing from a speaker on someone's porch. Richard stood near the front of the gathered onlookers' phone, raised, filming his son's opponent with the confident ease of a man who had already decided how this story would end. Real. I stepped out of my sandals and onto the warm pavement in bare feet. The September sun sitting low and orange over the rooftops of Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across a street that was about to learn something about the woman who lived at the end of it. Brandon rolled his neck, bounced once on the balls of his feet, and slid his hands into the gloves he'd have no time to actually use. I didn't put on gloves. I didn't need them. "Whenever you're ready," I said. The whole block held its breath. Brandon came at me exactly the way I expected him to. Cage fighters, even amateur ones, are trained to close distance fast, to use aggression as a weapon before technique even enters the equation. He lunged forward, with a looping right hand more show than substance. The kind of strike, designed to look devastating on a highlight reel, rather than actually land clean on someone who knew what they were doing. I'd seen that exact shape of aggression 1,000 times before in training rooms, and in places far less forgiving than a suburban cul-de-sac with string lights overhead. I didn't throw a single punch back. Not one. Not for the entire fight. That decision wasn't mercy. Not yet. It was strategy. A man who's used to being the most dangerous person in the room reads a counterpunch as confirmation that he's in a fight worth having. I wasn't interested in confirming anything for Brandon. I was interested in ending this as quickly and as cleanly as possible. I slipped his first strike with a small pivot of my hips, barely more than a shift in weight, and his momentum carried him half a step past me. The crowd made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a murmur, the specific noise people make when their expectations get quietly rearranged. Brandon recovered fast. I'll give him that. He had genuine athleticism buried under all that bravado, and spun back toward me with a low kick aimed at my thigh. I stepped inside it, instead of away, closing the distance he desperately wanted to control, and caught his extended arm in an arm drag that used his own forward momentum against him. It's a simple technique. Old as grappling itself, but simple only works if your timing is exact. And 20 years of training had given me nothing, if not exact timing. He stumbled forward off balance, and before he could reset his stance, I had my hip against his one arm, hooked around his waist in a body lock that took away everything he needed. Space leverage, the ability to generate power in any strike. He tried to muscle out of it. Brandon was strong, genuinely strong, the kind of gym-built strength that looks impressive under fluorescent lighting and video filters. But strength without structure just spits itself out fast. And I felt the exact moment his breathing changed. The exact moment his shoulders started working harder than they needed to, because his technique had abandoned him under pressure. I swept his lead foot clean and simple, and put him on the ground. The crowd's murmur sharpened into something closer to shock. Brandon scrambled back up almost immediately, jaw tight now, all the performance drained out of his face, and replaced with something raw, something closer to the truth of what was actually happening. He came at me again, faster this time, more desperate, throwing a combination that had real intent behind it. I felt the first punch graze past my ear close enough that the air moved, and something in my chest went cold and sharp and entirely, completely calm. The exact stillness I used to feel in the seconds before a breach, when your body knows exactly what it's built to do and simply does it. I stepped behind him. It happened fast enough that I doubt more than a handful of people in that crowd actually saw the mechanics of it. A rear clinch, hips dropping low. A trip that took his base out from under him before he even registered I'd moved. He hit the pavement hard, the wind audibly leaving him, and I was down with him before he could scramble away. Weight settled across his back, controlling the fight from a position he had absolutely no training to escape from. Every grappling exchange from that point forward was a foregone conclusion. He knew it. I could feel him know it in the way his struggling shifted from strategic to purely instinctive, the flailing of someone who understood, on some animal level, that he was no longer the one in control of what happened to his body. I secured his shoulder, isolated the arm, and locked it in place with the kind of control that made further struggle not just useless, but genuinely dangerous for him if he kept fighting it. Then I shifted to his neck. A controlled hold, nothing designed to hurt, only to communicate with total clarity that this was finished whenever I decided it was finished. I never threw a single punch, not once the entire fight. I want that understood clearly, because it mattered to me in that moment, and to everyone watching. This was never about hurting him. It was about ending something he'd started and refused over and over again to end himself. He tapped my forearm twice fast, the universal signal, breath ragged and desperate beneath me. I released him instantly. No hesitation, no lingering, no extra second held just to make a point. The moment he tapped, it was over completely, the way it should always be. I got to my feet first and extended a hand down to him, and after a long beat, pride visibly wearing with exhaustion on his face, he took it, and I pulled him up. The whole street was silent. Not a single phone lowered, not a single word spoken. 75 seconds by the timestamp on somebody's video that circulated later, though it felt both shorter and infinitely longer while it was happening. Brandon stood there in the fading gold light chest, heaving gloves, still on hands that had never once landed a real strike, staring at me like he was seeing an entirely different person than the woman he'd mocked for months. I leaned in close enough that only he could hear me. Winning isn't the same as humiliating someone. I said, I want you to remember that I had 100 chances to hurt you tonight, and I didn't take a single one. That was a choice. I need you to understand it was a choice. He didn't say anything back. He just nodded once, something in his face cracking open in a way that had nothing to do with the fight itself. I turned and looked for Ethan behind the fence and found him standing frozen, my phone forgotten in his hand, eyes wide with something I hadn't seen on his face in a very long time. Not fear, not shock exactly, but a kind of dawning recognition, like a puzzle piece finally sliding into place. I walked to him, put my hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "Let's go home. Behind us." I heard Richard's voice cut through the silence, sharp and furious, already reaching for his phone with a different purpose. Now that's assault. He was shouting to no one in particular, to everyone at once. Somebody call the police. She assaulted my son. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly how this was going to end, and it wasn't going to end the way Richard Coleman thought it would. The police arrived within 20 minutes. 2 cruisers, pulling up quietly at the edge of the cul-de-sac, while half the neighborhood still stood frozen in the deepening dusk plates of half-eaten barbecue forgotten on folding tables. Richard had called it in himself, breathless and indignant, using words like assault and unprovoked attack before the officers had even stepped out of their vehicles. I stood with Ethan near our driveway, arms crossed, loosely waiting, because I've learned that the worst thing you can do in a moment like that is act like you have something to hide. The younger of the 2 officers approached me first, notepad already out, and asked what happened. I told him plainly. Brandon had challenged me, publicly thrown gloves at my feet in front of dozens of witnesses, and I'd accepted a fight he initiated on his terms, using techniques designed to control and end the encounter without causing harm. I told him I never struck him once, not a single punch. He looked skeptical. Understandably, that's not usually how these stories go. But then people started coming forward, unprompted, phones already in hand. Mrs. Henderson, still holding my watch, played her video without being asked. The Delgado from 3 houses down had a clearer angle, catching the entire exchange from the moment the gloves hit the ground. A teenager who'd been filming for his own social media account had 11 seconds of Brandon shouting, "Put your money where your mouth is," in crisp, unmistakable audio. By the time 4 different videos had been reviewed on the spot, the picture was undeniable. I hadn't attacked anyone. I'd been baited into a fight I tried repeatedly to avoid, and I'd ended it without ever raising a fist. No charges were filed that night. The older officer, a heavy-set man with kind, tired eyes, actually pulled me aside as he was leaving, and said low enough that only I could hear, "For what it's worth, ma'am." That was about as clean as I've ever seen someone handle a situation like that. I thanked him and didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. Richard, for his part, did not let it go. Not that night, not that week, not that month. I understood somewhere in the weeks that followed that men like Richard Coleman don't experience public humiliation the way most people do. It doesn't register as embarrassment to be absorbed and moved past. It registers as a debt that must be collected, a wound that demands repayment, and he apparently decided very quickly that if the legal system wasn't going to hand him satisfaction, he'd manufacture it some other way. He hired a private investigator. I found this out secondhand through a neighbor who worked at the same law firm. The investigator used to source records a woman named Diane, who felt enough discomfort about the whole situation to give me a quiet heads-up over the fence one afternoon. Richard wanted everything. My employment history, my financial records, anything that might give him leverage to make my life difficult in ways that had nothing to do with what had actually happened at that party. What the investigation turned up instead was the truth about who I actually was. 22 years of service, multiple deployments, command experience in the 75th Ranger Regiment that most civilians, even well-connected ones like Richard, had no real frame of reference for understanding. Decorations he'd never heard of, and couldn't properly research the significance of. A current posting at Army Futures Command that put me in rooms with people whose names occasionally made it into defense industry newsletters. Richard actually subscribed to, though he'd apparently never made the connection between those names and his quiet neighbor with the dented pickup truck. I found out later through Diane again that this revelation didn't discourage him. If anything, it seemed to embolden him, further feeding some belief that a woman with that kind of career had powerful people to answer to, people who might be persuaded that she'd embarrassed the Army by brawling with a civilian at a neighborhood barbecue. He began drafting letters, formal ones, on his company, letterhead addressed to the Department of Defense, alleging conduct unbecoming, demanding an official inquiry into my actions. I learned about the letters before they were even sent, because Richard in his confidence mentioned it to another neighbor at the mailbox. Clearly hoping word would spread and reach me, hoping the mere threat would be enough to make me anxious, apologetic, smaller. He wanted to see me sweat. He wanted, I think, some visible confirmation that he still held power over the situation, power he'd felt slipping away from him ever since his son tapped out on his own front lawn in front of the whole block. I didn't sweat. I want to be honest about that. Not out of arrogance, but because I understood something Richard fundamentally didn't. I hadn't done anything wrong. I defended myself. I defended my dignity, and I'd done it with more restraint than most people would have managed under the circumstances. There was no version of an honest inquiry that ended badly for me. The only real question was what an inquiry into Richard's motivations might turn up. Instead, a question I hadn't even thought to ask yet, but one that the universe, or something very close to it, was already quietly answering. Ethan asked me one night sitting at the kitchen table over dinner whether I was worried. I remember exactly what I told him, because I meant every word of it. Worry is for situations you don't understand, I said. I understand this one completely. Richard is a man who has never once in his entire life faced consequences for the way he treats people who don't have his money. He genuinely believes that will hold true forever. I've watched men like that before. Ethan, it never holds true forever. He didn't look entirely convinced. He was 15 and 15 doesn't yet believe that patience is its own kind of weapon. But he trusted me enough to let it go, to finish his dinner, to go back to being a kid worried about algebra tests instead of federal complaints. I trusted something else entirely. Something I'd learned a long time ago in far harder circumstances than this one. When you build your entire life on cutting corners, on leaning on money and influence instead of integrity, that foundation eventually cracks under its own weight. You don't need to push it. You just need to wait and let the structure do what unstable structures always eventually do. I didn't know yet how quickly or how completely that structure was about to come down, but I had a feeling, and in my experience, feelings like that are rarely wrong. The letter landed on the desk of Lieutenant General Michael Donovan on a Tuesday morning, in late September, tucked into a stack of routine correspondence his aide had already flagged for review. I only know the specifics of what happened next, because Michael told me himself, weeks later over a phone call that started serious and ended with both of us laughing harder than either of us had in months. Michael and I went back a long way. We'd served together early in my career before he climbed into the rarefied air of 3-star command, and I settled into the work I do now at Futures Command. He wasn't just a colleague. He was one of the handful of people who'd watched me grow from a green second lieutenant into someone who could hold a room of colonels, silent with a single sentence. And he had over the years developed what I can only describe as a very specific, very dry sense of humor about anyone foolish enough to underestimate me. He told me later that he read the first paragraph of Richard's letter, An aggrieved account of conduct unbecoming an officer, involving an unprovoked physical assault at a private social gathering, and had to set it down for a moment because he was laughing too hard to keep reading. Ashley Parker. He told me he'd said out loud to an empty office, got challenged to a fight, and this man is mad she won. But amusement is not the same as dismissal, and Michael, whatever else he is, has always been thorough. An inquiry was opened exactly as Richard had hoped it would be. Statements were requested, video evidence of which there was an abundance, given how many phones had been recording that Labor Day evening was reviewed in full. Within days, it was clear, beyond any reasonable dispute, that I had done nothing except respond with considerable restraint to a challenge that had been thrown at my feet in front of dozens of witnesses. The inquiry into my conduct closed almost as quickly as it opened, with a formal note in the record, commending clear's throat the composure I'd shown under public provocation. But inquiries once opened have a way of generating their own momentum, and somewhere in the process of verifying the basic facts of the incident, someone on Michael's staff pulled Richard Coleman's business background as a matter of due diligence standard procedure. When a formal complaint involves a private citizen making serious allegations against a serving officer, what they found had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with the very foundation Richard Coleman had built his comfortable life upon. Richard's real estate development firm had, for years, been bidding on municipal contracts, including several tied to public infrastructure projects that received partial federal funding. That connection, thin as it might have seemed, was enough to draw the attention of people whose job it is to notice when federal money intersects with irregularities. And once they started looking, they found quite a lot. Falsified bid documentation on at least 3 contracts. A network of shell subsidiaries that existed as far as anyone could determine for no purpose, other than allowing Richard's firm to sidestep local minority contractor requirements while appearing to comply with them on paper. Payments to a county zoning official that once traced through several intermediary accounts looked far less like consulting fees and far more like what they actually were. I want to be clear about something because it matters to me that this story is told honestly. I did not orchestrate this. I made no calls, wrote no letters, pulled no strings. I have never in my entire career used my position to settle a personal grievance. And I wasn't about to start over a neighborhood dispute involving a man who threw gloves at my feet at a barbecue. What happened to Richard Coleman happened because Richard Coleman built his empire on a foundation of dishonesty, and he made the singular catastrophic error of inviting official scrutiny into his own life at the exact moment that scrutiny was primed to look closely at everyone involved. The Defense Contract Audit Agency got involved, first given the federal funding tied to some of his projects. Then the FBI once the zoning payments surfaced clean enough to warrant a proper investigation. The IRS followed, not long after once his shell company structure came under examination and raised the kinds of red flags that auditors dream about. Within 6 weeks of sending a letter meant to destroy my career, Richard Coleman found himself the subject of 3 separate federal inquiries, his development contracts frozen, pending review, tens of millions of dollars in projects suspended indefinitely. I heard about all of it in pieces the way you hear about a house collapsing from 2 streets over the sounds. We first, then the dust, then eventually the full shape of what happened. Diane, my neighbor with connections at the law firm, kept me loosely updated always, with the same note of disbelief in her voice. He did this to himself, she said to me once, almost in wonder. He had a legitimate business. He didn't need to cut those corners. He just couldn't help it. Brandon's world came apart on a parallel smaller track, the gym where he trained, sensing the shift in his father's reputation, and unwilling to be associated with either the viral video of his defeat or the mounting federal scrutiny surrounding his family, quietly suspended his membership, citing conduct concerns related to the Labor Day incident, which had by then been viewed close to 2 million times across various platforms. His sponsors, a regional supplement company, and a local gym apparel brand, both issued polite, carefully worded statements distancing themselves from him within the same week. The highlight reels stopped. The captions stopped. For the first time since I'd moved to Cedar Ridge, Brandon's garage stayed quiet in the mornings. I felt something complicated watching all of this unfold. Something that wasn't triumph, not exactly. I'd spent my whole career believing that consequences, real consequences, tend to find people eventually, without needing anyone to manufacture them. I hadn't wanted this for Richard, not specifically, not with this scale. I'd simply wanted to be left alone to raise my son in peace, to live the quiet life I'd earned after 2 decades of service. But I also understood, watching it happen, that this wasn't really about me at all. It never had been. Richard Coleman's downfall had been built years before I ever moved on to Lark Spur Lane. I had simply been the thread that once pulled, unraveled something that had been fraying all along. Ethan asked me one evening in October, watching the news cover a local segment about the fraud investigation, whether I felt bad about it. I thought about that question longer than I expected to. No, I told him finally. I feel bad for anyone who has to watch their family fall apart. That's a hard thing to witness, even when the person falling built the entire collapse themselves. But I don't feel responsible for it, Ethan, and neither should you. We didn't do this. We just stopped absorbing what wasn't ours to carry, and everything else followed its own gravity. By late November, the Coleman house sat with a 4 sign planted crooked in the front lawn. The kind of sign that goes up when a family is selling out of necessity rather than choice. I watched it from my porch some mornings, coffee in hand, and I felt none of the satisfaction I might have expected to feel back in September, when Richard was still filming my fight with his son and shouting about assault to a police officer who clearly wasn't buying it. Watching a family lose their home doesn't feel like victory. It just feels heavy in a different, quieter way than everything that came before it. The bank foreclosed in early December. I found out from Diane, who'd become something like a genuine friend over those months, that Richard's legal fees alone had eaten through whatever cash reserves the family had left, once the federal investigations gathered speed, and once his development contracts stayed frozen through the fall building season. The income simply stopped coming in fast enough to cover what he owed. They moved out on a gray Tuesday morning. A moving truck backed into the driveway, where Brandon used to rev his motorcycle at 6:11 a.m. And by that afternoon, the house was empty, and the street was quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet since before I'd moved in. Nobody threw a party about it. Nobody gathered at the mailbox to gossip with any real relish. Nay, I think in the end most of the neighborhood had simply grown tired of the noise the Colemans brought with them everywhere they went, and their absence felt less like a triumph and more like an exhale, a street finally allowed to settle back into itself. Brandon came to see me the week before they left. I remember being surprised by the knock on my door, surprised further to find him standing there alone. No phone in hand, no audience, nothing performative about the way he stood on my porch, with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, shoulders drawn in a way I'd never seen on him before. He looked younger than 22 in that moment. He looked honestly like a kid who'd finally run out of road. "Bat, I wanted to say something before we go," he said, not quite meeting my eyes at first. "I've been thinking about it a lot. The fight, everything before it too. The stuff with Ethan's bike, the way I talked to you, all of it." He paused, jaw working like the words were harder to get out than he'd expected. "I should have listened to all of it. You tried to tell me something that day at the party, and I was too busy trying to look tough in front of a camera to actually hear it." I stood in my doorway and looked at him for a long moment. This young man, who'd spent months treating our street like his personal stage, now standing there with something genuinely humbled in his posture. "Beal," I thought about all the ways I could respond, all the things I could have said about accountability, about the family he was leaving behind, about the version of himself he'd have to build from scratch somewhere new. In the end, I kept it simple, because I found that the truest things usually are. "Strength isn't measured by who you can beat," I told him. "It's measured by who you choose not to hurt. You had 100 chances that day to walk away before it ever got to gloves on the ground, and you didn't take a single one of them. That's the lesson here, Brandon, not the fight. What happened before the fight? He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something behind his eyes that looked like it might actually stick. Can I say sorry to Ethan? He asked. Before we go, I called Ethan down from his room, and I watched from the kitchen doorway as the two of them stood on my porch. Brandon apologizing in a voice stripped of all its old bravado. Ethan listening with the particular grace that 15-year-olds sometimes surprise you with, the grace of someone who never needed revenge, to feel whole, only acknowledgement. They shook hands. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just two boys in their own way, closing a door that had been open and swinging too long. The Colemans moved 3 states away somewhere. Richard apparently had extended family who could offer him a fresh start once the legal dust settled. I heard secondhand that he eventually pled to a reduced set of charges, paid substantial restitution, and lost his contractor's license permanently. I didn't feel the need to follow the story much further than that. Some chapters close on their own, and you don't need to read every page to understand how the book ends. Cedar Ridge went back to being exactly what the listing had promised me back in June. Quiet, unremarkable, peaceful in the specific way that only comes after storms pass through and clear out. I still run every morning at 5:30. Same gray shirt, same worn-in shoes, same empty street, humming with early light before the rest of the neighborhood wakes up. But something's different now. Something small but real. The neighbors who used to look past me, who never quite registered the woman at the end of the street stop now. They wave. Sometimes they walk out to their mailboxes a little early just to say good morning. And I always say it back, because that's what neighbors do when the noise finally clears enough to hear each other properly. Ethan's doing well. He made varsity soccer that spring, and he doesn't talk about that summer much anymore though. Every once in a while, when someone at school tries to push him around the way Brandon once did, I notice he doesn't flinch the way he used to. He just watches calm, unbothered, the exact stillness I spent 20 years learning myself quietly pass down without either of us ever really discussing it. I think about that whole season often, honestly, not with anger, not anymore, with something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds, because it taught me all over again, something I'd already learned once in a much harder place under much harder circumstances, that patience isn't passivity, and walking away isn't weakness, and the people who mistake your restraint for fear are always eventually the ones who learn the hardest lesson of all. Bullies mistake patience for weakness. They never realize that the strongest people are usually the last ones looking for a fight. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where it found you today. Drop a comment below and tell me what part hit hardest. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who believes quiet strength always wins in the end, hit subscribe, because we've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, week after week. Let's keep this journey going together. The video was 11 seconds long. 11 seconds to end 14 years of marriage. I watched my husband laughing beside another woman, watched my daughter wrap her arms around this stranger like she'd known her forever, and then I heard the words that stopped my heart cold. I wish she were my mom. I didn't cry, I didn't call him. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at a birthday cake with candles slowly drowning in their own wax. And I made a decision that would change everything. By midnight, I had already opened my laptop and started typing the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage. My name is Emma Sullivan. I'm 40 years old. And until that night, I believed I understood the shape of my own life. I run an interior design firm that caters to clients who think nothing of spending 6 figures on a living room. And I built that business from nothing, while raising a daughter and holding together a marriage that for a long time felt solid. I am not a woman who panics. I plan. I organize. I control what can be controlled, and I make peace with what can't. That night, none of that mattered. It was my 40th birthday, and I had asked for exactly one thing: dinner with my husband and daughter. Nothing elaborate. Jack had promised he'd pick up Olivia from her friend's house and be home by 6. I made a small dinner instead of ordering something extravagant, because I wanted it to feel like ours. 3 plates, a bottle of wine we'd been saving for an occasion neither of us had ever named. Peas I'd bought myself, because Jack always said he'd bring peas and always forgot. And some tired, hopeful part of me thought that if I bought them, it would feel like he had. 6 came and went. By 8, I stopped pretending the food mattered and just sat there, phone in hand, watching the screen for a text that wasn't coming. At 9, I finally called. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I told myself there was traffic and accident, something reasonable. At 9:42, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no explanation, just a video file. Some instinct told me to leave it unopened and go to bed. But I've never been good at leaving things unfinished. I pressed play. The video was shaky, clearly filmed by someone standing off to the side in what looked like Riverside Park, 3 miles from our house. And there was Jack in the gray jacket I'd bought him for Christmas, standing in dappled afternoon light, with an easy open smile on his face, the kind I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. Beside him stood a woman I didn't recognize, blonde, poised, effortlessly confident, and crouched in front of them both in her favorite denim jacket was my daughter Olivia, 12 years old, all elbows and half-formed opinions. In the video, she leaned into this stranger's side, let the woman's arms settle around her shoulders like it belonged there. Jack didn't step in. He just stood there watching that same soft smile on his face, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Then the woman said something I couldn't fully hear, her voice low coaxing, and my daughter looked up at her with an expression I had never once seen her give me, and said the words I will hear for the rest of my life. I wish she were my mom. The video ended there. 11 seconds. Just enough to detonate something inside me that I didn't know could still be detonated. I sat very still for a long time. I could already see it perfectly every time I closed my eyes. Could already hear the particular pitch of my daughter's voice, that soft, wanting tone she used to use with me when she was small, and asking to be picked up. I thought of the winter she was 7, curled against me on the couch, her head heavy on my lap through an entire movie she'd already seen a dozen times, just because she liked falling asleep to the sound of my voice, narrating along with it. I looked at the birthday cake on the counter, candles guttering wax pooling onto white frosting I'd piped myself the night before. I watched them burn down to nothing. I want to tell you, I fell apart. Maybe some part of me did somewhere underneath the stillness. But what actually happened is that I stood up, blew out the candles myself, and walked to the small desk in our bedroom, where Jack kept his laptop charger, and I kept mine. I opened my computer. I searched divorce attorney, then how to file for divorce in our state. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything else that night. By the time I heard Jack's key turn in the front door sometime after 11, I had already drafted the outline of a petition. I hadn't decided not fully what I would do with it, but I knew with a certainty that settled into my bones like cold water, that the woman who had spent all evening waiting at that table, hopeful and foolish and full of love, was someone I would never let myself be again. The door opened at 11:14 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the digital clock on the stove, counting down to a confrontation I hadn't planned, but somehow already knew was coming. Jack walked in first, keys jingling in his hand, and Olivia trailed behind him, scrolling through her phone with the particular boredom only a 12-year-old can perform so convincingly. Neither of them noticed the cake or the plates or the flowers that had gone limp in their vase on the counter. "Sorry we're late," Jack said, not even looking up as he hung his jacket on the hook by the door. Traffic on the bridge was insane. I didn't answer right away. I watched him move through our kitchen with the ease of a man who believed the evening had gone exactly as he'd intended, and something in that ease made my stomach turn. Olivia finally glanced up, saw the cake, and had the grace to look faintly guilty. "Happy birthday, Mom?" She said the words, arriving late and thin like an afterthought. "Where were you?" I asked. My voice came out calmer than I expected. Jack finally looked at me properly, and something in my expression must have registered, because his easy smile faltered. "I told you I picked Olivia up and we grabbed a quick bite." I lost track of time. "With who?" He hesitated. Just a half second, but I caught it the way you catch a single wrong note in a familiar song. "Just we ran into someone. It wasn't a big deal, Claire," I said. I hadn't known her name until I said it, but somehow watching his face, I knew I was right before he confirmed it. His jaw tightened. "How do you know that name?" I picked up my phone, opened the video, and turned the screen toward him. I watched his face while it played, watched the color drain slowly from it. When it ended, the kitchen was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. "It's not what it looks like," he said finally. "She just wanted to say hi to me, Mom," Olivia said quickly. Too quickly. I was joking. I didn't mean it. I looked at my daughter at the earnest, slightly frightened way she was watching me, and I wanted badly to believe her. But I kept hearing her voice in that video, soft and certain, and I understood that whatever she said now, under the pressure of my silence, wasn't going to erase what I'd already seen. "Go to your room, sweetheart," I said gently. "I need to talk to your father." She went without arguing, which told me more than anything else that night. Once her door clicked shut down the hall, I turned back to Jack. 14 years, I said. "I have given this marriage 14 years, Jack. I have built a business around the edges of your schedule. I have never once put my own birthday ahead of this family. And you spent it in a park with your first love, letting our daughter call another woman the thing she should only ever call me. Emma, you're overreacting." It was innocent. Claire just wanted to see Olivia catch up. "Nothing happened. Nothing happened," I repeated, and something in my chest went very cold and very quiet. "You let another woman put her arm around my daughter, and you stood there and smiled about it. That's not nothing. That's a choice." Here's a truth I didn't understand yet. That night, one I'd only pieced together years later. Jack had never been a man who built things. He was a man who let things happen to him and called it fate. I would come to learn that Claire herself had spent years insecure in her own past relationships, terrified of being left, and that she'd found in Jack's passivity something she could finally shape without resistance. But that night, all I understood was the shape of my own husband's silence, and how long I'd mistaken it for gentleness instead of the absence it actually was. "You're being dramatic," he said, running a hand through his hair. "This is exactly why I don't tell you things. You always blow everything out of proportion." Those words landed somewhere old and tender, a place that had absorbed 1,000 small dismissals over the years, and simply learned to stay quiet. I thought of every complaint I'd swallowed to keep the peace, every late dinner reheated alone, every school event attended by myself while telling our friends he was just swamped at work. I walked past him into our bedroom and pulled my suitcase down from the closet shelf. "What are you doing?" he asked, following me, his voice shifting from defensive to something closer to alarm. "I already looked up an attorney," I said, folding a sweater with hands that had somehow found their steadiness again. "I'm not doing this tonight. I'm not screaming, but something changed tonight, and I don't think it changes back." "You're really going to end our marriage over an 11-second video?" I stopped folding and looked at him. "I'm ending it over 14 years of learning that your comfort always matters more than my dignity." The video just finally showed me the proof. He didn't have an answer for that. I finished packing in silence, kissed my sleeping daughter's forehead without waking her, and left the house before midnight, driving to my sister's place with a suitcase and a certainty I hadn't felt in years. Jack called 17 times that week. I let every single one go to voicemail. He assumed I think this was a storm that would pass the way our disagreements always had. He didn't sign the separation papers when I first sent them. He waited confident I'd come back. 1 week later, I filed for divorce for real. No longer a draft on a laptop screen, but a real petition stamped and dated, sitting in a county courthouse with my name on it. I remember standing outside that courthouse afterward, watching strangers walk past with their ordinary, undisturbed lives, and thinking that somewhere behind me in a house I decorated with my own hands, a 12-year-old girl was waking up to a family that no longer looked the way it had the day before. And there was nothing I could do to soften that for her, not when I was still learning how to stand upright myself. Grief has a strange way of becoming furniture. You don't notice it anymore, but it's always there. Or some heavy familiar shape you've learned to walk around in the dark. 3 years passed that way for me, one careful step at a time, until one day, I looked up and realized I'd built an entire life around the empty space Jack and Olivia had left behind. The divorce had finalized quietly after months of custody negotiations that left me with alternating weekends that slowly, painfully dwindled into something closer to alternating months. Jack moved in with Claire within the first year. Every time Olivia mentioned Claire's apartment instead of Dad's apartment, something in me flinched. My business at least gave me somewhere to put all that displaced energy. What had been a modest interior design firm grew into something with a waiting list and a reputation. Pride, I learned, doesn't fill a house. It doesn't answer when you call out, "I'm home to nobody." Olivia's visits grew shorter, then rarer, then mostly canned. "She's got a project due," Jack would text. "She made plans with friends. Hope that's okay." I always said it was okay. Because what else could I say from 300 feet away, tethered to a court order that gave me rights on paper but not in practice? Every cancelled weekend felt like a small private erosion. I didn't date. I told my sister it was because I was too busy. And that was partly true. But the fuller truth was that I didn't trust my own judgment anymore. I had spent 14 years reading Jack as a devoted father, a partner who simply had blind spots. And I had been wrong in a way that still made my stomach drop when I thought too hard about it. It was a Tuesday in early spring when my firm opened a second location, a converted warehouse space in the town where Jack and I had first bought our house together. I flew in for the ribbon cutting, telling myself it was purely professional. One of the contractors we'd hired for the build-out had brought along a colleague to consult on the historic building's original woodwork. A woman, he introduced, simply as someone who knows this building's history better than anyone. That woman was Rachel Morgan. Though I didn't recognize her at first, not until she mentioned almost in passing that she used to teach 4th grade at the elementary school 2 streets over, and that she'd once had a student named Olivia Sullivan. We spoke only briefly that morning, professional and pleasant, and I thought nothing more of it as I moved through the rest of the ribbon cutting, shaking hands with contractors and city officials, feeling strangely disconnected from the version of myself that used to grocery shop 3 blocks from where I now stood. Afterward, I walked through the shopping center nearby in no particular hurry, enjoying a coffee before my flight home. That's when I saw them. Jack, Claire, and Olivia walking out of a bookstore together, laughing at something none of them bothered to explain to each other. Olivia had grown taller, 15 now, her hair longer, styled differently than the way I remembered brushing it out on Sunday nights. She looked from a distance, happy in a way that hollowed something out of my chest. I should have turned and walked the other direction. Instead, I stood frozen near a shop window, watching my daughter loop her arm through Claire's, the way she used to loop hers through mine. Watching Jack reach out to steady a shopping bag, slipping from Claire's shoulder, with the automatic tenderness of a long marriage. They looked unmistakably like a family, and then I heard it. Olivia's voice, bright and unthinking, calling out to Claire about a coffee shop across the way. "Mom, can we go there before we head back?" "Mom?" Not a slip of the tongue. It came out easily, the way a word comes out when you've said it times before, and it no longer feels strange in your mouth. I don't know how long I stood there, long enough for Olivia to glance up and notice me across the plaza. Our eyes met. For one suspended second, I thought I saw something flicker across her face. Recognition, maybe even longing. Then it was gone, replaced by something polite and distant. She gave me a small formal nod, the sort you'd offer an old family friend you couldn't quite place, and turned back to Claire and Jack. I don't remember walking to my car. I remember sitting behind the wheel, hands pressed flat against my thighs, breathing slowly, the way I'd taught myself to breathe, through hard client meetings, and harder court dates. I was reaching for my keys when a light knock sounded against my window. I looked up to find Rachel Morgan standing there watching me with an expression that wasn't pity exactly, but something more urgent. I rolled the window down. "Emma," she said, "I saw you outside the bookstore just now." I wasn't going to say anything. It's not really my place. But she glanced once over her shoulder toward the direction Jack and Claire and Olivia had disappeared. Then back at me, her voice dropping lower. "There's something you need to know about a video from your birthday 3 years ago. I think I know more about it than you do." I sat in my car in that parking lot for another 20 minutes, engine off, listening to a woman I barely remembered unravel 3 years of my life, with a steadiness that felt almost cruel in its calm. Rachel Morgan had been Olivia's 4th-grade teacher, the kind of teacher parents remember fondly, because she'd been patient with a shy, stubborn 7-year-old who used to cry over spelling tests. I hadn't thought of her in years, not until that morning at the ribbon cutting, and even then, I hadn't connected the dots until she was standing outside my car window, with an expression that told me she'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. "I was at Riverside Park that afternoon," she said once we'd found a bench near the edge of the lot. 3 years ago, the week of your birthday. I go most weekends. I like the trail by the water. I wasn't looking for anything. I just happened to be there." I waited, my hands folded tightly in my lap. "I saw Jack and Olivia first," she continued. "And then a woman joined them, blonde. I didn't know her at the time. I only learned her name was Claire later." She had a phone out, almost immediately filming. I noticed because it seemed odd the way she kept adjusting the angle like she was trying to get a specific shot. My stomach tightened. "Go on." "Olivia was 12, Rachel said gently. She didn't want to hug her. I could see it clearly even from where I was standing. She kind of pulled back, crossed her arms, looked uncomfortable. Claire kept coaxing her, saying things like, 'Come on, don't be shy.' Pulling her in closer. Jack was standing right there. He didn't step in. He just watched, smiling like it was all very sweet." I thought of the video, the 11 seconds I'd replayed in my mind 1,000 times over 3 years. Always assuming I was watching something spontaneous, something true. "There's more," Rachel said, her jaw tightening. I heard Claire say something to her right before that final line. She leaned down and said quiet, but I was close enough to catch it. She said, "Say this, sweetie. Bye, it'll make your mom so happy." The air seemed to leave my lungs all at once. She didn't understand what any of it meant, Rachel said. I don't think she understood who was even filming it or why. I assumed at the time it was just an odd, slightly staged family moment. I didn't think anything more of it until I heard through mutual friends that you and Jack had divorced not long after. Then, why tell me now? My voice came out rougher than I intended. "Because I still have the video," she said finally. "I filmed a little of it myself on my phone. Just habit, I film everything when I'm out walking." I caught part of that exchange by accident. I've had it sitting in my camera roll for 3 years, telling myself it wasn't important. But I saw your face just now across the plaza when Olivia called that woman. "Mom, I couldn't just walk past you and say nothing." She pulled out her phone without hesitation and showed me 11 seconds of grainy sideways footage that confirmed everything she just told me. Claire's voice, unmistakable, coaching my daughter through a line she was too young to fully understand. Jack standing there silent, complicit, simply by doing nothing. I sat with that footage for a long time after Rachel left, replaying 3 years of my life through this new unbearable lens. I thought about every night I'd cried quietly in my car after a canceled visit, telling myself Olivia simply didn't want to see me anymore. I never once considered that it might have been engineered by a woman who understood exactly what a 12-year-old's unthinking words could do to a marriage. I would learn more about Claire later, pieced together slowly over the following weeks. Mostly through things Jack let slip once the truth started coming apart. Claire had been left twice before, by men who'd chosen other women right in front of her. And somewhere in that history she'd built a private, brittle conviction that love had to be secured, engineered if necessary, never simply trusted to hold on its own. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me understand later that she hadn't seen herself as a villain in that park. She'd seen herself as someone finally taking control of a story that had gone wrong for her twice already. Jack, I came to understand, hadn't been an active architect of any of it. He wasn't a man who plotted. He was a man who avoided conflict so completely that he simply let stronger wills carry him wherever they wanted to go, and mistook that drifting for peace. It didn't make what happened forgivable, but it made it somehow sadder. I thought of Jack's face on the night I confronted him the way he'd insisted it was innocent. Nothing happened. I was overreacting. He hadn't lied about being there. But he had let me believe for 3 years that everything I'd seen was simply the truth revealing itself. That our daughter genuinely preferred another woman. When the truth was that she'd been a child coached and confused, saying words that weren't fully her own. Rachel touched my shoulder before she left. "Emma," she said, "I don't think Olivia ever knew you saw that video. I don't think she has any idea what it did to your marriage." I looked up at her, something cold and clarifying settling into place behind my ribs. "She doesn't know," I repeated slowly. "I don't think so," Rachel said. "I think she spent 3 years believing you simply stopped wanting to see her as much. I don't know what Jack told her about the divorce, but I don't think she has any idea that video ever existed at all." I flew home that night, instead of the next morning changing my return flight right there in the terminal, because I knew if I gave myself 12 more hours to think I might talk myself out of what I was about to do. I didn't call Jack. I didn't call Claire. I had learned in the slow way grief teaches you things that confrontation rarely changes anyone's mind, especially people who've spent years building comfortable stories about their own innocence. Instead, I asked Rachel to send me the clip. And 2 days later, once I'd had time to steady myself, I sent it to Olivia directly. I didn't add commentary. I simply wrote, "I think you should see this. I love you. That's all I want to say for now." Then I put my phone down and made myself wait. She didn't respond that night or the next day. On the third evening, my phone rang, and when I answered, I heard my daughter crying before she managed a single word. "Mom," she said, and something about the way she said it, thick and broken, and entirely her own voice, undid something in my chest that had been braced tight for 3 years. "Mom, I was only 12. I didn't understand why she wanted me to say that. I just wanted her to stop asking. I let her cry for a while before I said anything. I had promised myself on the flight home that whatever happened in this conversation, I would not make it about my own anger. So, I simply listened. And when she finally quieted, I told her gently that I didn't fully understand it either, but that I was glad she finally knew the truth existed." Over the following days, pieces started coming apart on their own. Olivia told me she'd confronted her father directly, asking if he remembered that day in the park, what Claire had said to her. Jack, according to Olivia, had gone quiet, then tried to explain it away as just a moment that got exaggerated over time. A phrase so carefully evasive that even a 15-year-old could hear the hollowness in it. Claire's reaction was worse. She'd grown defensive almost instantly, insisting she didn't remember the specifics, accusing Olivia of twisting an innocent moment, eventually snapping at her to stop bringing up ancient history. Something about that anger, Olivia told me, had felt more damning than any explanation could have. It was in the days that followed that the fuller shape of things emerged. Going through old messages on a shared family tablet, Jack had never bothered to fully log her out of Olivia found deleted message threads. My messages, the ones I'd sent over the years, asking to schedule visits, asking how her recital went, asking if she wanted to come stay with me over spring break. Dozens of them sent to a shared number Jack and Claire had access to message after. Message Olivia had apparently never seen because Claire had quietly deleted them before Olivia ever picked up the tablet. "She told me you were busy," Olivia said, her voice cracking again. "She told me you didn't really want to see me as much anymore, that you were focused on your business." I believed her mom. I believed her for 3 years. I sat very still absorbing that. 3 years of canceled weekends I had accepted as my daughter's natural drift away from me. 3 years of silently believing whatever bond we'd had simply hadn't been strong enough to survive Claire's arrival. And the entire time someone had been quietly closing the door between us and letting me believe I'd walked through it myself. I'm not telling you this to make you hate your father, I said carefully. Or Claire. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know the truth, whatever you decide to do with it. I don't hate him, Olivia said slowly, but I don't understand how he just stood there both times. I didn't have an answer for that, not fully. Even now, there's a particular kind of cowardice that doesn't announce itself, that simply exists in the space of things a person chooses not to notice, because noticing would require action they aren't willing to take. In one of those late-night calls, somewhere between the anger and the grief, Olivia suddenly laughed quiet and surprised at herself. Do you remember, she said, when I used to fall asleep on your lap during movies, even ones I'd already seen 100 times? I remember, I said, my throat tight. You always made me start them over if you fell asleep before the ending. I still do that, she admitted, just with different people around now. It's not the same. 2 weeks after that first call, Olivia told me she'd packed a bag. I don't want to live there anymore, she said, steady now. Something in her voice that reminded me sharply of myself at her age, before life had taught me to second-guess my own instincts. I want to come stay with you, if that's still something you want. I had to sit down on the edge of my bed before I trusted myself to answer. It's the only thing I've wanted for 3 years, I told her. Olivia arrived on a Friday evening with 2 suitcases and a backpack, standing on my doorstep in the fading light, looking younger than her 15 years. The way children sometimes do when the weight they've been carrying finally shows on their faces. I didn't ask her a single question. I just pulled her into a hug and felt her exhale against my shoulder like she'd been holding her breath since that day in the park. We didn't talk about Jack or Claire that first night. Instead, on a whim, we ended up in the kitchen close to midnight, pulling out flour and sugar, because Olivia said she hadn't had real homemade cookies since I was a kid, which made me laugh because she still very much was one. We made a mess of the counter, argued good-naturedly about whether the dough needed more vanilla, and ate half the batch straight off the tray before it had properly cooled. It wasn't a conversation about healing. It didn't need to be. It was just 2 people relearning how to occupy the same kitchen without anything standing between them. The unraveling on the other end happened without my involvement, though I heard about it in pieces over the following weeks. First from Olivia, then unexpectedly from Jack himself. He called me on a Tuesday, his voice rough in a way I hadn't heard since the early years of our marriage. He told me Claire had grown increasingly erratic since Olivia moved out first, blaming Olivia for stirring up drama, then turning her frustration on him for not controlling the situation. It was during one particularly heated argument, Jack said that Claire had finally admitted in the middle of shouting about being blamed for ancient history that she had coached Olivia through that line in the park deliberately. She said if she hadn't done it, Jack told me, his voice cracking, I would have never fully left you. She said she needed to be sure this time that she wasn't going to lose someone the way she had before. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, letting that settle, understanding, not for the first time, that hurt people sometimes build their safety out of other people's wreckage without ever quite seeing themselves as the ones causing it. She admitted to the messages too, he continued. The ones to Olivia. She said she was scared that if Olivia kept close contact with you, she'd eventually want to move back. And Claire didn't want to lose the family she'd built. I didn't offer him comfort. I let him sit in the silence of what he'd just told me, because I think for the first time in years, Jack needed to feel the full weight of a consequence without someone softening it for him. I let it happen, he said finally quietly. Even before I knew about the coaching, I let her decide how much contact Olivia had with you. I told myself I was staying neutral. I wasn't neutral. I was just absent the way I was absent that night at the park, the way I was absent the night of your birthday. Why are you telling me this, Jack? Because Olivia deserves an explanation better than the one I gave her, he said, and because I think you deserve to know none of it was ever about you not being enough. It was about me not being brave enough to stop something I could see happening. Claire left him 2 weeks later, packing up most of her things over a single weekend, while Jack was traveling, leaving behind a note that framed the relationship as something she'd sacrificed everything for, only to be blamed and unappreciated in return. There was no acknowledgement from what Olivia described of the years of quiet manipulation that had built the relationship in the first place. Jack was, by every account I received, entirely alone in that house for the first time in years. I felt something when I heard that, though it surprised me how small and distant it was. Not the sharp satisfaction I might have expected 3 years earlier, and not quite pity either. Mostly, I felt the strange hollow ache of watching someone finally arrive at a truth about themselves that had been available to him all along. Olivia and I settled into a rhythm over those weeks that felt for the first time in years uncomplicated. She started at a new school in the fall closer to my house, and I watched her slowly unclench, laughing more easily, asking me questions about my own teenage years, the way she used to before Claire entered the picture. We repainted her new room together one Saturday, badly paint splattered on both our jeans, and she told me halfway through that it was the most normal she'd felt in 3 years. It was a Thursday evening, almost 2 months after Olivia moved in, when I heard a car pull into my driveway that I didn't recognize at first. I looked out the kitchen window and saw Jack standing beside it, hands in his pockets, staring up at my front door like a man who had walked a very long way to get there and wasn't entirely sure he had the right to knock. I opened the door before he knocked, because I'd been watching him stand there for almost a full minute, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight like a man, rehearsing words he still hadn't found the courage to say. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went beyond sleep, the particular exhaustion of someone who has finally stopped running from himself. "Emma," he said, "I know I don't have any right to just show up like this." "You're right," I said, "you don't." But I stepped aside anyway and let him into the front hallway. Because whatever else was true, Olivia was upstairs and some conversations needed to happen with both of us in the room or not at all. I called her down. She came slowly, cautiously, the way she did whenever her father's presence introduced an uncertainty she hadn't fully learned to navigate yet. Jack looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face cracked open some careful composure he'd built up on the drive over. "I owe you both an apology," he said. "A real one. Not the kind I've given before. That was really just me trying to make myself feel less guilty." He didn't make excuses. He told Olivia plainly that he had let a woman manipulate a 12-year-old into saying words she didn't understand, and that he had stood there and watched it happen without stopping it. Not because he hadn't noticed, but because some part of him had wanted exactly what that video eventually produced. He told her he was sorry for every deleted message, every canceled visit he never questioned closely enough. Every year he let her believe her mother had simply stopped choosing her. Then he turned to me. "Claire didn't destroy our marriage," he said quietly. "I know that now. I keep wanting to tell myself she did, because it's easier than admitting what I actually did, which was nothing. I stood there and let her do it. That night in the park, every night after, I was never brave enough to stop it. And now I've lost years. I can't get back with both of you." I let the silence stretch after he finished. 3 years earlier, some old tired part of me might have rushed to fill it with reassurance. I didn't do that this time. "I forgive you, Jack," I said finally, and I meant it in the specific way that forgiveness sometimes means letting go of a debt without expecting repayment. "I don't carry the anger anymore. It's not doing either of us any good. But I need you to understand that forgiving you doesn't mean going back. Some things, once they're broken, cleaned through, don't reset just because the truth finally came out." He nodded slowly, something in his shoulders releasing like a man who had been bracing for a harsher verdict and was startled by the gentleness of the one he actually received. "I don't expect us to go back," he said. "I just didn't want to keep living without saying that out loud. To both of you," he cried then quietly. And Olivia crossed the hallway and hugged him, tentative at first, then fuller. And I stood back and let them have that moment without inserting myself into it. Some repairs belong only to the people doing the repairing. In the months that followed, Jack and I built something new out of the wreckage. Not a marriage, but a working piece. He picked Olivia up on the weekends we agreed on. He came to her school recital and sat 2 rows behind me, without either of us making it strange. We learned slowly and imperfectly how to be two separate people who had once built a family together, and now had to figure out how to keep loving the same daughter from different houses. A year passed. Olivia grew taller again the way teenagers do in sudden increments and started talking about colleges, about wanting to study economics. A career I never would have guessed for her back when she was small and stubborn over spelling tests. She laughed more. She called me unprompted just to tell me about her day. My 40th birthday had ended in 11 seconds of devastating video. My 41st had passed quietly, still raw, still finding my footing in a new custody arrangement. But my 42nd arrived differently. Olivia insisted on planning the entire evening herself, wouldn't let me help with a single detail. Just told me to be home by 6 classing and trust her. When I walked into the kitchen that evening, there was a small cake on the counter, slightly lopsided, clearly homemade, with my name written in careful, uneven icing. The same recipe we'd made together that first messy midnight in my kitchen a year earlier. Just 2 plates. Just the 2 of us. Beside my plate sat a folded piece of paper, and when I opened it, I found a letter in Olivia's handwriting, 3 pages long, telling me things she said she'd never quite known how to say out loud, about missing me during those lost years, about the video, about how grateful she was that I never once made her feel guilty for something that had never been her fault. "I know it's not fancy," Olivia said, watching me read a little shy. "But I wanted it to just be us this year." I looked at her, at the careful effort in every detail of that small kitchen, at the daughter, who had found her way back to me across 3 lost years, and a manipulation neither of us had asked for. And I felt something in my chest ease that had been holding tight since that night. I watched candles burn down to nothing. "It's perfect," I told her, and meant it more than she could possibly know. She lit the candles herself, and as she set the cake in front of me, she smiled, this easy, unguarded smile I hadn't seen since she was small. "I'm exactly where I belong, Mom," she said. I leaned forward and blew out the candles, and for the first time in a very long time, the smile that broke across my own face wasn't something I had to work to find. It was simply there, waiting, the way I think it had been waiting all along. For the moment, my daughter and I finally found our way back to each other. If this story stayed with you, that means everything to me. Stories like Emma's are the ones I love telling. Most quiet people who hold on to their dignity, even when everything around them falls apart. If you felt something while watching, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And if you want more stories like this one about family betrayal and the strength it takes to start over, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, and I'd love to share them with